Welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Today we're going to be talking about Alfred Nobel, one of the most important people in some ways in the history of the world. And Chris, I think our listeners are going to find Alfred Nobel's story very interesting.
Yeah, I believe that this is an explosive podcast that we're going to do today. And I feel that there's I had to throw it in there, right?
Yeah. Some things just, they lend themselves to that.
Well, and it's a very powerful episode. And I think there's two things just to start off with. Number one, no one can ever fully predict the consequences of their actions. Right. I think that the story of Alfred Nobel is going to lead exactly to that. The things that he does, people don't recognize the good that can be brought out of this, but also the bad that can come out of this. The other thing that I think is fascinating about Alfred Nobel is how at a very early age, and we see this all throughout history, that parents see something in their child. And it might be something that the child hasn't seen yet, but the parent sees it in, and they will surround the child with a solid education, with opportunities, and all of these things to really help prepare them for the future. And I think, Ray, that is so important in today's society, that we recognize the value of education, but also of putting children into places where they can figure out what they want to do. They can figure out what they like, what they don't like. And that's what happens here, right? Alfred Nobel, I don't want to say that he's forced into it, but I think that he is encouraged into a particular path based on what his dad had done and based on some other things. But I think he takes it and says, yeah, this is something I really, really want to do. And he changes the world because of it.
Yeah, his father is a guy called Emmanuel Nobel. Well, let me go back a little bit here. Alfred Nobel is born in 1833 in Stockholm, Sweden. And Chris, we were saying off the air that's one of those places for me. If you think, well, where do you want to visit? Well, Stockholm, Sweden would be the place that I would love to visit one day. But his father was a guy called Emmanuel Nobel, and he was, I guess, involved in architecture and construction there in Stockholm. He built buildings. He was even involved sort of, I guess you could say, sort of a similar direction as his son in a way, as he was involved in figuring out ways to blast rock for purposes of construction. So you see a little bit of what his son would ultimately do in some of his activities there. His mother was, of course, a lady who came from a well-to-do family, let's say, a family that was sort of well-to-do. Emmanuel Nobel had a successful business doing well. Things didn't remain that well. Things didn't remain that good because, of course, he's ultimately going to have to file bankruptcy. And the family is going to go through a very difficult period because of the troubles with the business.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things I think about Emmanuel Nobel is one interesting fact that people might not know is that Emmanuel Nobel actually had a plan to build a canal at Suez, later on becoming the Suez Canal, but he actually had the forethought and he understood the best way to do it would be to use explosives. And, this is a monumental discovery, so much so that a group of people known as the Russians will become very intrigued by his thoughts and use of explosives, that he will actually be commissioned by the Russians to develop landmines for the sole purpose to defend army bases and towns, and also sea mines to protect harbors and dock ships. Now, Ray, when those plans come into fruition, they're not defensive measures, but they will become offensive measures. And so I find it interesting that happens to Emmanuel, and that's actually going to happen to Alfred as well. But, Emmanuel does see something in Alfred to the point where he decides to send him off to schooling. He makes sure that he's tutored in the sciences, he understands the humanities. And it's interesting that even though Alfred put him into these really good schools, or Emmanuel put Alfred into these really good schools, Alfred never graduates. he never gets a degree. However, he is still going to be trained with some of the best chemists and industrialists that are out there to give him the, I guess you could say, the real world knowledge and not necessarily the book knowledge to be successful. And once again, Alfred Nobel and Emmanuel Nobel a little later in life will work hard to try to compete against another group of people that are people might be familiar with, the Rockefellers, and that they will be responsible for trying to end the Rockefellers' monopoly, if you will, on the world's supply of oil.
Yeah, you were talking about his education and everything that Emmanuel did to sort of bring that about. Emmanuel failed there in Stockholm, ultimately having to go bankrupt. They moved, I believe it was to Finland, and he spent some time in Russia as well. And he eventually built himself back up to where, like you said, the Russian leadership noticed him and he became very successful again. And that was part of the reason he was able to give his children, including Alfred, I think he had 3 sons, 2 other sons, I believe, including Alfred, this great education with private tutors, like you said. So he had, in some ways, Emmanuel built himself up, fell down, and then built himself up again, doing what they had to do, where his wife even went so far as to open her own little, I guess we could call it, convenience store type of thing, in order to make ends meet and to sort of build themselves back up. Ultimately, in 1842, Emmanuel is going to move the family to St. Petersburg, Russia. And at this particular point, Alfred is, of course, getting one of the best educations money can buy, I'm sure. And just to tell you about how well educated Alfred would be, he would be fluent in German. He would be fluent in English. He would be fluent in Russian. He would be fluent in French. And of course, his native tongue of Swedish, he would be fluent in all of these tongues. So this is a guy that well-educated, fluent in multiple language, loved poetry and literature, but he also loved chemistry. So this is a guy who's well-educated, very intelligent, and it seems like, knew how to put his mind to stuff.
And especially in the chemistry part, that's kind of where all of this starts to develop. And, you mentioned the down times that Emmanuel had with his family, but I think that there's also the word perseverance that sticks with his family, of never giving up. And, if at once you don't succeed, try again, right? And so you'll start seeing that there are multiple efforts going to try to fix things and using products that are already out there. And Alfred, I think they go back to Sweden, if I'm not mistaken. And I think you mentioned that. And so Alfred goes back to Sweden where Emmanuel is, and Emmanuel has been studying this particular solution, if you will, of nitric and sulfuric acid and gelatin. He did not discover that solution. He just took that solution that had been discovered and made into something, Ray, that many people know of today as nitroglycerin.
Yeah.
He took nitroglycerin and he was able to turn it into an explosive. So this is where, I mentioned earlier about the consequences of one's actions. Ray, you and I understand the value of nitroglycerin and what nitroglycerin does to individuals who have heart issues and things like that. We're told you take a nitro pill, you put it underneath your tongue, and it's supposed to help your heart. He sees it as being used as a potential explosive and begins to work alongside of Alfred and the other children in creating nitroglycerin as an explosive instead of, this tool for health.
Yeah, and a lot of people prior to Alfred's work with nitroglycerin, a lot of people at the time considered nitroglycerin to be too unstable, that you couldn't necessarily use it in a gun like it can gunpowder because, it could just explode. And that's, of course, not what you wanted. So what he wanted to do was find a way to use it in a way that it could be productive. So, for example, using it in construction. How could we take nitroglycerin, use its explosive power and the particular mix of nitroglycerin. Of course, it wasn't just nitroglycerin, but used this explosive power in a way to be able to benefit construction workers. And remember, one of the things his father had been interested in back in Stockholm was, blowing up rocks to try to move large rocks for construction workers and I guess building roads and that kind of things. But of course, they had, before they were going to be able to move into actually using this nitroglycerin in that way, they had to deal with the safety problems that would that could potentially be a problem, because the last thing you want is for this to be unstable, like many people at the time knew it was, and then it accidentally blow up unexpectedly and kill a lot of people or hurt a lot of people. That, of course, wouldn't be very productive.
Yeah, you got to have a detonator, right? You got to have that thing in place so where you can set it up. And I do not know anything as far as chemistry, physics, and all of that. But Ray, I love watching them blow up a good building that they're tearing down. I just think it's fascinating how they set those detonators all around the building, and they bring it down in such a smooth, easy transition. And so when our listeners watch one of the demolitions of a building, you are able to discover it requires detonators, and it has to be done in a very safe environment. And so I find that to be really, really cool how Alfred Nobel, within a year of really discovering that you can use nitroglycerin as an explosive, he's produced a detonator that they'll call a Nobel lighter, and that it will be that detonator that military and civilian blasting companies will use to bring down buildings or to create roads or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of things that Alfred does that we don't attribute to him, but he had a very important influence in it.
Yeah, it wasn't a smooth road for him. I mean, we've already talked about his father going bankrupt when they were in Stockholm. Later on, his father's going to go bankrupt again. And then when Alfred's back in Stockholm, Sweden in 1864, they're going to be working with nitroglycerin, and one of his brothers is killed in an explosive. We were talking about a minute ago, it being unstable. So it's killed in an explosive along with several other people, an explosion along with several other people. And the government there is basically, as a result of that, going to ban work with this stuff. This is too unstable. This is too dangerous. And, but he's going to keep going, keep working with nitroglycerin and trying to find a way to make it more stable, trying to find a way to make it less dangerous. So they're going to be adding chemicals to it. Like you, Chris, I never took chemistry in high school or college, so I know absolutely nothing about it, but they did mix nitroglycerin with some other items that would make it a little bit more safe. And ultimately, Chris, in 1867, he's going to patent a material under the name dynamite.
Yeah, and dynamite coming from the ancient Greek word for power, right? And that it can bring enemies to a stop. It can bring buildings down. It can, make a hole where there's never been a hole before. And, I think that it is in this moment when Alfred probably thinks that what he's doing is something that is really good. The problem becomes that it doesn't take long before this dynamite becomes a devastating weapon of war, especially being used in the Spanish-American War. It will be used in World War I. But I think you start to see things start to change for Alfred, because you mentioned his brother dying, Ludwig.
Yeah.
And when his brother died, Alfred really receives a shock, because he opens up the newspaper, and it's a French newspaper, and there's an obituary, and the obituary is his own obituary. It's Alfred Nobel, and and what they do, in the headline in the French newspaper said, "The Merchant of Death is dead." And Alfred Nobel reads that, and he's thinking, "Oh my gosh, this is what they think about me," because the obituary went on and it said, Nobel became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before. That's not what his intention was with dynamite. That's not what he wanted. But once again, the consequences of one's actions. And that is a huge issue, that really starts to develop, for him. And Nobel becomes mortified. And I think what happens in that moment, how you have that moment that just like changes your life forever. And I think for Alfred, he in that moment says, I'm going to spend the rest of my life ensuring that I have a positive legacy instead of a negative legacy, if you will, with all that's being developed. But Ray, I don't know about you, but a stick of dynamite, people can use anything for nefarious means. And I don't know, you might disagree, but I think Nobel wasn't necessarily in it for the money, but I think that he was really in it to try to do something good. He was finding a more, what's the old phrase? Work smarter, not harder.
Right.
And don't you think that maybe that was what he was trying to do?
I think to some degree, and I believe if I'm trying to look back through my notes, I believe he and some of his family members had actually gotten into some oil business, if I'm not mistaken.
The oil business?
Right.
Yeah, remember that was when I mentioned earlier, he was going up against Rockefeller because Rockefeller had the Standard Oil Company. I mean, that and that might be a whole other podcast that we need to think about, because Rockefeller was, just ruthless when it came to, taking over these small companies. And especially as gas is going higher and higher, it might be interesting kind of go back and look at that. And so I think Nobel, even going against John D. Rockefeller, he was trying to break up those monopolies. He was trying to give people, an understanding of how to live fair and how to live right, and how to, to be justified in what you're doing.
Yeah, and one of the more interesting things I find, and this is just, when you're researching a person, reading about a person, you're going to often sometimes find something that you didn't expect, and with Alfred Nobel, I found one.
Ooh.
He placed an ad when he was in his 40s. He placed an ad in a newspaper. Did you read about this? Sort of like a Lonely Hearts ad. And he advertised, and I'm going to quote here, for a wealthy, highly educated elderly gentleman seeks lady of mature age, versed in languages, as secretary and supervisor of household. Okay. So anyway, he comes to meet this woman, an Austrian woman named Bertha Kinski. I may have mispronounced her name there. She works for Nobel for a period of time, then goes and marries a guy by the last name of von Suttner. But she's going to remain friends with Alfred for a number of years, despite her marrying this other man. And she's going to become a very prominent person. You mentioned a few minutes ago, and I am wrapping this around to go back to what you were talking about, that she would become very influential in this peace movement, in going against the arms race, going for peace. And that is something that, she will ultimately be rewarded for when she is awarded the 1905 Nobel Peace Prize.
Wow.
Long way to get there, but I finally got there.
And he never married, I think, right? I mean, I don't think he ever married. I think he had a relationship with someone who was like really young, 23. He was like 45, but he never really had that relationship. And I assume that Bertha basically became his confidant, I guess, and pretty much the keeper of all things Nobel. She kind of knew, but and I think that kind of goes back to Nobel having this change in the course of his life, of making sure that people remember him for who he was and what he tried to do instead of what people did with the things that he came up with. I found a couple interesting tidbits about him, but one I'll share now was that he actually is one of the very first Google Earth people, if you will. He wanted to try to connect people throughout the world. You know how there's Google Earth where you can go, and you can look at everything and see. I mean, they can look at your home from China. They can plug in your address. They can find your home. Well, he actually used balloons and tried to connect different points and was trying to map out, if you will, like Earth, that would connect different people. So I saw that was pretty fascinating, that he was trying to turn his way of thinking into a positive thing. And I also read somewhere he had like 355 patents mentioned to his name, right?
All sorts of stuff. Yeah. He was definitely an inventor, not just dynamite, but other things as well.
And I guess it should be known. I mean, even though that might not have been his focal point, but he came into a lot of money and he was very successful with this.
Yeah.
So in an effort to try to restore his legacy, he decides to turn something into good, and he creates this thing that people know about today, I guess, this prize for peace. And what do they call it?
Yeah, he invented the Nobel Peace Prize. And actually, he didn't do this in his lifetime. After he died in 1896, he had left much of his fortune for this prize that was going to be given in areas like literature, peace, medicine, physics, chemistry, all these areas that he wanted this prize to go to, people who did great work in those areas. And I mentioned earlier this lady he was friends with, Bertha. She actually in 1905, and I believe I already mentioned this, won the Nobel Peace Prize. The prize that he started after his death, or that he had made sure would be started after his death in 1896. And so they formed the executors of his will formed this organization known as the Nobel Foundation. And, the rest is history, because even to this day, we have the Nobel Peace Prize in different areas where the Nobel Peace Prize is awarded. And I believe we have presidents of the United States, recent presidents, who have been granted the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, it's definitely an honor you want to be able to claim on your resume or in the end of your life, your legacy. But I found something interesting about that Nobel Peace Prize. And there's an early version of his will that basically said that the award of the Peace Prize would be restricted to a period of 30 years. Like, as soon as it started, it would only be for 30 years, right? This Peace Prize. And it was his opinion that if harmony was not achieved in that 30 years time period, that the world would not be saved from continual, irrational, violent, and destructive relationships. So think about that for a second. He felt, and I guess this is like from, let's just say 1905 to 1935, right? He's thinking, if we don't get this straight in the next 30 years, then the world is going to be irrational. It's going to be violent. It's going to be temperamental. It's going to be destructive. And so what happens after that 30 years? World War II, where some of his inventions used once again. And notice where we are today. We talk about biological warfare. We talk about all of these things that are being used as far as explosives. And I remember the other day, they were bringing back the guy that was on the plane in Detroit several years ago. He was trying to smuggle a bomb or something in through his shoes. And that's why we have to take our shoes off, whenever we're flying in plane to be searched nowadays. But some of that reasoning that guy was trying to do comes back to the work of Alfred Nobel. And so I just think he was a prognosticator who said, listen, if you don't get your act together, world, in 30 years, we're in for trouble. And I don't want my legacy to be associated with the trouble. I want it to be associated with good. So he has those Nobel Peace Prizes, and every year they're given out.
Yeah.
But Ray, every year, I think we continue to miss the mission of what the Peace Prize was all about, bringing harmony to all people. And it's so sad that we continue to miss that mark.
Yeah. And, I was thinking as you were talking about that with Alfred Nobel, you sort of have two bookends on his life. If I were to go out on the street and tell people that the same man who invented dynamite also created the Nobel Peace Prize, they would probably not expect that to be the case. But you see with Alfred Nobel that, on one side early in his life, dynamite, on the other side later in his life, the Nobel Peace Prize. So you see sort of these bookends where he creates dynamite, not for purposes of war, not for purposes of terrorism and destruction, but for purposes of construction. How do we blow our way through these mountains? How do we, level this territory, whatever the case may be? How do we blow up this rock so that we can build a building here, or whatever the case may be? So he invents the dynamite with peaceful purposes in mind. And then he ends his life with peace, the Nobel Peace Prize, warning the world that if we don't get things straightened out, we're in for a mess. And of course, you mentioned World War II, but World War I as well. Right there in the middle of that 30-year window is World War I, then World War II, and look at what's going on even today. So his warning, I think, was very, borderline prophetic.
Yeah, and one last thing I'll share about Nobel that I thought is kind of like your story about Bertha. And when he dies and this foundation has been established, I want to say he gave away over $500 billion in today's money is what it was worth, based on the income and the wealth that he had. But when he died, there's fighting over that, right? So here's this man of peace. And even after they died, they start fighting over his fortune and his foundation. Where's going to be the home? Where can he go? And you mentioned early on, Nobel left Sweden at an early age. And so when he left Sweden at an early age, he really wasn't considered a citizen of the country. Actually, he wasn't considered a citizen of any country. And because of his international character, you mentioned all the different languages that he spoke. And so the problem is, when he dies, who oversees the foundation? Who oversees his fortune? Who is in charge of the liquidation of his properties? And there is disagreement among these nations because, of course, they want it. They want the recognition. They want some of the money. They want all of these things. And so I found this interesting, that the determination of which country's courts would have control of Alfred Nobel's fortune and foundation would go back to an old French custom, an arcane French custom. And according to French practice, a man's residence was the place that he kept his carriage horses. So the nation that gets to be in charge of his foundation and of his fortune is where Alfred kept his horses. And Ray, Nobel had moved his horses to Sweden before his death. And all because he moved his horses to Sweden, ultimately, they considered him to be a resident of Sweden, and the Nobel Peace Prize, which maybe you'll win one day, Ray, for bringing everybody together. You'll get your dream, and you'll be able to go to Stockholm, Sweden, and you'll be able to celebrate your being honored as the Nobel Peace Prize winner of 2035.
Well, that's optimistic, I must say.
You solved all the problems.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about that. I think that's awfully optimistic, but I would like to go to Stockholm one day. So, Chris, thanks for another great episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I hope our listeners enjoyed this episode. Find us wherever you find your podcast. We're on Stitcher, we're on Spotify, and the number of places you can access our podcast is growing on a regular basis. So make sure you look us up on whatever podcast platform you're using.
Yeah, I think it's been great. I can't wait for us to continue moving on to other topics. And I hope people will, chime in with some topics. And Ray, thanks for your research. I hope you found him to be fascinating. I know I did. And honestly, in my opinion, I will go back to the beautiful words of good old JJ. You remember him, right? Dynamite.
Yep.
That's how this episode was.
I had a feeling we were going to go there before the end of this.
I had a blast. Thanks.
Yes, you did. You did. Well, we'll end it right there. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.